Morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Northwood University Freedom Seminar. I'm pleased to present this morning a person who is well known here at Northwood, a person who's spoken at previous Freedom Seminars, and he always has a great presentation for us, and I anticipate this morning will be no exception to that. The thing I respect about our speaker this morning, Michael Tanner, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. The thing I respect about Michael's work is it is an effort to create a bipartisan or nonpartisan approach to solving the problems of poverty and inequality in America. I know this stems from a real concern that he has. He's not just an intellectual, he's very active in trying to produce change in our public policies in particular. He's been working on this for many years at the Cato Institute, where he's a senior fellow, as I mentioned. His research emphasizes investigation into the causes of poverty and inequality. He's done research on entitlement reform. I want to recommend highly the book that he has written on the topics that he's going to share with us today. It's called The Inclusive Economy: How to Bring Wealth to America's Poor. And it's really a great primer on the kinds of public policy reforms that the poor need to gain access to the American dream. And so I'd like to welcome Michael here this morning. Michael, take it away.
Well, thank you so very much, and I appreciate your having me back. I've always enjoyed the Freedom Seminars, and I wish we could be doing it in person, but perhaps next year. They're always terrific events, and I hope you're getting a lot out of it. I've seen your agenda, and you've had some terrific speakers, so I know I've got a very tough set of acts to follow on this. I do want to talk to you a little bit today about fighting poverty from a free market perspective. And I think this is something that people who believe in free markets don't talk about nearly enough. And we really should, because, well, number one is we actually have some answers for how to deal with poverty, which I think that others do not. Second, I think just from both moral and practical grounds, we should care about poverty. The goal, after all, of public policy, the reason we're doing all of these things, the reason we're studying these things, the reason why we have public policy at all is the goal of human flourishing. The idea that we want to give everybody a chance to become all that they can be, to achieve everything that's within their grasp. And that includes the least among us, the people who need help the most. And we certainly should want to make it accessible to them as well. And then, of course, the simple practical grounds. We don't want to become like some Latin American countries where you have a gated community with the wealthy hiding behind walls and the masses outside trying to get in and hit them over the head and take what they've got. That's not exactly the recipe for a stable government or a stable society. So we should really care about what we're doing in terms of poverty. So I want to talk to you a little bit today about some ideas on this. And I want to start right at the beginning, go all the way back and ask a very simple and very basic question. And that is, why are people poor in the first place? And I think if you go out and you look around both the political and academic worlds, you'll find that there's two basic camps on this, that the arguments divide in two ways. On one side, and I should mention that these two groups kind of bitterly butt heads. They disagree rather vehemently with each other, and they tend to argue both in academic conferences and in legislative floors about these things. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about both sides on this, and then kind of tell you where I come down on. On one side of the debate, and I think given the agenda and the speakers you've had already, I think you've heard a little bit about this, are people who suggest that poverty is basically the result of individual behavior and individual choices. Sometimes you hear it expressed as a culture of poverty. That is, people are poor because of things they do or don't do in their lives. And a lot of this is built around something that's called the success sequence. You may have heard about it without actually getting the name attached to it. But this is something, and statistically, it bears out. And that is that if a person essentially graduates school, at least high school, they get a job, any job, even a part-time job, even a minimum wage job, they get a job, and then they don't have children until after they're married, they are very unlikely to be poor. This is true both in the aggregate and it's true on an individual basis. For example, about half of all people who drop out of high school live below the poverty level. Almost nobody who graduates college lives below the poverty level for any extended period of time. Less than 3% of people in America who work full-time live below the poverty level, or where someone in the household works full-time live below the poverty level. In fact, even part-time work, only about 15% of people who work part-time live below the poverty level. So having a job makes a big difference compared to being unemployed, where you're about 40% of unemployed people are poor. And finally, we know that if you have a child and you're outside of marriage, you're about 5 times more likely to live in poverty than if you wait until after you're married before you have children, or if you don't have children at all. So each of these things sort of bears out statistically. Now, I would say bear in mind the simple fact, the bane of all statisticians, and that is the idea that correlation is not causation. The fact is people who have other problems that are more likely to make them poor may be more likely to drop out of school, or they may be less likely to get a job, or they may be more likely to have children outside of marriage. In fact, we'll talk about a couple of these things later on these things. But statistically, you certainly can make a very strong case that each of these individual decisions, individual choices, these cultural things, all matter when it comes to whether or not people are going to be poor. On the other side of the equation are people who argue that the issues are more structural, and they point to issues such as race, gender-based discrimination, economic dislocation, and like people who want to make the cultural argument, they too have a lot of evidence to support them. The fact is this country has an abysmal history of racism, and still today does not treat African Americans and other people of color equally. You can go back and simply look at the work done by Julian Simon and others to look at the fact that between slavery and Jim Crow and ongoing discrimination, the African American community has been deprived of over $10 trillion in capital. You can see how these sort of things move on. What's often referred to systemic racism does not mean a system full of racists. What it means is an ongoing sort of drip, drip, drip through the system of past actions that still have ramifications today. Give you just one example is that for most white families, their largest portion of their wealth is in housing. Well, until actually fairly recently, within my lifetime, it was the explicit policies of the federal government to redline or to prevent African Americans from owning homes in many areas. Levittown, just to give you one example, the quintessential suburban community that you've all read about, actually had clauses that prevented any African American or any non-white person from buying a house in Levittown. Well, today the descendants of those people still live there. They have those houses, or they've sold those houses and passed them along in one way or another in ways that have built wealth that have been denied to the African American community. So you do have issues of race that still play a role in African American poverty. Gender-based discrimination is not the same thing, of course, because you have intervening generations. It's not necessarily where wealth passes down from male to male to male. You could have female generations in between breaking those things up. And yet we should remember it wasn't that long ago that only 30, 40 years ago that women were not allowed to have credit cards, for example. All of these things still have ramifications today. And finally, you can look at economic dislocation. I'm a believer, a strong believer, in the glories of free market capitalism. It has done more to create wealth and to lift people out of poverty than anything else in history. But it doesn't always land equally. And as an economist, I often use the example. I say, look, when we invented the automobile, we created a great deal of wealth. We left people better off. Nobody wants to go back to the horse and buggy era. Yet, if you were a buggy whip manufacturer, in fact, you were the best damn buggy whip manufacturer in the entire world, you may have gone out of business anyway. And you lost your job out there, and maybe you were, in your 50s or 60s, and it just wasn't possible to retrain you as an auto mechanic. You were left behind by all that wealth that was being created for many other people. So you have these sort of issues that exist today. Free trade, for example, is marvelous. It creates more winners than losers by a long margin. It generates a great deal of wealth. It reduces consumer costs. We're all better off with as free as trade as possible. Yet there's no doubt that there are some jobs that are lost because they are not able to compete with overseas jobs or overseas locations. So clearly you've got some people who are going to be losers and have questions of what's going to happen to them. So where do I come down on these two competing theories? I think there's actually something true to both of them. I don't think you can treat the poor like as if they don't matter, as if their decisions and their choices are meaningless. Sometimes you listen to people on the left and it sounds like the poor are chaff blown by the winds of fate and nothing they do will ever change anything. There's no way that they can get out of poverty. And we know that that's just not true. But it's also a very condescending way, I think, of looking at the poor and talking to them. I don't think you want to do anything like that. On the other hand, I can also tell you that all of us, when we make our decisions, whatever our decisions and our choices are, they are always made within certain constraints. And the fact is, some people in this country face different sets of constraints than others. If you grow up a white kid in the middle class in the suburbs, you face a very different set of constraints on your choices than if you're a poor minority kid in the inner city growing up in an area where there's no jobs, where the school system sucks, where the police hassle you every time you step foot outside your door. You're going to end up making a very different set of choices and decisions in your life. And I think we have to take these structural issues into account. They can't simply be brushed off or ignored when we look at what's going to happen with poverty. So I think both the sort of cultural individual behavior school and the structural school have a lot to say about where poverty is, and we have to address issues that affect both of those. But in the end, I'm going to argue that it really doesn't matter which of those two you fall into. You can buy into one or the other, or like me, both. But in the end, it doesn't matter because whatever it is we're doing now to address either of those simply isn't working. And what we're doing now is largely throwing money at the problem. The federal government every year spends about 1.2, $1.3 trillion fighting poverty last year, not counting all the COVID relief bills and all that, just on normal anti-poverty programs, about $1.2 to $1.3 trillion. And state and local governments throw in another $300 billion or more. So we're spending more than $1.5 trillion every year fighting poverty. The federal government operates more than 100 different anti-poverty programs. About 70 of these provide benefits directly to individuals. The others provide benefits to low-income communities, so things like the Community Development Block Grant and things of that nature. So for all of these programs and all this money we're spending, we still seem to have a lot of poverty. If you go down to inner city Detroit, an area that gets a lot of these programs, a lot of this money, it's pretty hard to say that those are communities that are thriving, that you have human flourishing going on. Now, we should be careful about this. These programs do reduce poverty rates. And this should not be a surprise. If you give people money, they have more money than if you didn't give them the money. I mean, if we flew over the country in an airplane and shoveled $1.5 trillion out of the back of it, we would do something to reduce poverty, or at least to reduce poverty rates. The question is whether or not we're doing anything to actually eliminate poverty and get people out of poverty, or are we simply trying, doing stuff that makes poverty less miserable? And I think too much of our focus is on making the poverty less miserable and not enough on sort of giving people control over their own lives. You think about it, if you have any psychology students out there, you might be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's a pyramid. And at the bottom of that pyramid are the things that are simply necessary to survive. Food, shelter, clothing, things of that nature. The things that are necessary for people just to get on in life. And we do a terrific job in this country, actually, at providing those. Very few people in this country are starving to death. We're not the South Sudan, someplace like that. I mean, mass starvation doesn't go on. We don't have famines in this country. But as you move up to the top of the pyramid, at the top of the pyramid is self-actualization. As we move further up that pyramid, we do a worse job all the way. And we do very little in the end to enable people to become all that they can be. We want people to become masters of their own destiny, masters of their own fate, self-supporting, taking care of themselves and their family, able to become whatever it is that their talents enable them to become. We do a very poor job on that. And that is really where we should be focusing more of our poverty efforts or anti-poverty efforts. We tend to focus everything down here on this bottom survival sustenance level. And that may be necessary, but it's not sufficient. We really need to do a much better job of getting people out of poverty once and for all, rather than simply trying to make poverty less miserable for them, because it's never comfortable. And in doing this, as I've looked into this, I've come up with one sort of breakthrough idea, what the government can do if it wants to help people get out of poverty. And that is, it can stop making people poor. You actually look at far too many government policies and government programs, and they actually end up in the end pushing people into poverty to begin with, or making it very difficult for them to climb out of poverty as we go on, after they're already poor, or if the circumstances force them into poverty. We make it very hard for them to get out. So let me tell you a few areas that I think are ripe for reform, and sort of for the bipartisan reform that we should be able to get people to buy into, regardless of their political ideology, for these things. The first of these is criminal justice reform. Now, you might ask, okay, what does criminal justice have to do with poverty? The reality, criminal justice actually ends up having a lot of effects that actually on low-income people that pushes them into poverty. And first of all, we know that the criminal justice system is not applied equally across the board, and that low-income communities and communities of color are far more likely to bear the brunt of criminal justice policies that need to be changed. Start with simple fact of overcriminalization in this country. The United States locks up more people for crimes than any country in the world, with the exception of the Seychelles Islands. I have absolutely no idea what's going out there this side of the Seychelles out there, but any place else in the world locks up a lot less people than we do. In fact, we're almost 2 to 1 more than the next highest amount of people, including some very despotic countries. In large part, part of this is because we tend to put people in prison versus other types of dealing with crimes. But in part, it's because we have far too many things that are crimes. We tend to over-criminalize in the society a great deal. And the obvious ones that people talk about all the time are things like the war on drugs, on that. We do a war on sex work, which is the same thing as the war on drugs, except applied to women instead of black men. But it goes on far further than that. We should not forget about the fact that Eric Garner in New York was killed for the crime of selling an untaxed cigarette. So we really overcriminalize things far too much, and throwing these folks in jail has a domino effect throughout these low-income communities that leaves people in poverty. For one thing, you take breadwinners in many families out of the equation, or you take, as William Julius Wilson from Harvard pointed out, you take marriageable men out of the marriage pool. I mentioned earlier one of the things in the success sequence, and one of the things that folks on the right talk a great deal about, is having women who have children outside of marriage. And it is absolutely true that women who have children outside of marriage are far more likely to be in poverty. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. I mean, the simple fact that, what do you do in terms of child care? How do you work if you can't find child care? If the children get sick, you have to take time off. Employers are less likely to hire you because they know these things are going to happen. There's a lot of good reasons for it. And the simple fact that two earners can bring in twice as much in income as the one earner can. So it's clearly better. But one of the reasons why you're going to end up with so many women having children outside of marriage is, first of all, sex is a normal, natural thing. Women are, people are going to have sex. You'd prefer that they had it after they were married, but you're taking enormous numbers of men outside of the marriage pool. As William Julius Wilson mentioned, 1.5 million young black men are not marriageable material because they are either in jail or on probation or have a criminal record that makes it difficult for them to get the type of job that would enable them to support a family. And mentioning criminal records, it's another area that drives people into poverty. The fact is that you can make a foolish mistake when you're your age, and you end up with a criminal record on your record, a felony conviction because you had marijuana or something like that. Not in Michigan, I guess now, but still too many places in this country. Or some other petty crime, you end up you hit somebody in a parking lot because you're drunk, and you end up with an assault conviction or something of that nature. You're carrying that around. It makes it very difficult for you to get a job in the future. And not just a job, but you often can't get into certain colleges. You can't get scholarships. Landlords can ask about it, so you often can't find an apartment. All of these things combine to make it very difficult for you to support yourself, and certainly much harder to support a family. These criminal records follow you around forever. It's been estimated by folks at Vanderbilt University that if we were to enact comprehensive criminal justice reform, we could reduce the poverty rate through that alone by about 20%. So that's a pretty significant impact on poverty if we're simply doing some things that we can do in the criminal justice reform area, decriminalize things, deal with plea bargaining problems, deal with three strikes laws and over sentencing. There's a host of things we can do that would lead to fewer people being caught up in this carceral system that we have right now in terms of the criminal justice. Second area we need to look at is our education system. As I mentioned earlier, if you drop out of school, you're pretty likely to end up living in poverty. If you go on to college, you're very unlikely to live in poverty. But the fact is, our government schools in this country don't do a very good job of educating, and they particularly don't do a very good job of educating people who live in low-income areas. Yet, people who live in those areas are kind of stuck in those underperforming government schools. We don't have meaningful school choice in much of this country. If you're a parent and you live in a neighborhood where the only school is doing very little to teach your kids, it's violence riddled. The teachers have checked out a long time ago. There's very little you can do in terms of changing that. I mean, we can move, and I'm going to talk about housing in a minute. But you can't simply send your kids where you want them to go. In fact, in some states in this country, it is a crime. It is a felony in some states to send your child to a school outside of their assigned school district. And we know that how segregated many school systems still are today. In fact, they've actually grown more segregated in the last couple of decades. And we know that many people of color live in communities in which the schools do very, very little in terms of actually educating children. So we need to do something in terms of granting more opportunities, more choice for parents in terms of controlling their children's education. And I should add that it's not just a question of sending kids to better schools. That certainly will help. But it's also a question of making the schools better themselves. What we need to have is more competition and more entrepreneurship within the school system itself. The schools improve. Basically, we have done very little in terms of changing schools in the last few hundred years. Essentially, you would see very little difference between a classroom in 1700 and a classroom today. Now we use a computer monitor instead of a blackboard or a whiteboard, but the way of teaching, the pedagogical model is essentially unchanged throughout that whole period. What we need to do is come up with new ideas on how to teach, better ideas to educate our kids, and you're not going to get that in a monopoly system. If anything, monopolies, if we learned anything about monopolies, is that they don't do a very good job when it comes to customer service. And our education system is not any different than that. Third, and it kind of leans into this, is housing. Housing actually surprised me when I started doing my research on poverty, how big an issue housing really was. But I'm actually think it's almost near the top of the list in terms of the areas that need reform. The fact is that where you live has an impact on almost everything in this country. Do you live near jobs? Do you live in an area with good schools? Do you live in areas with high crime rates? And we segregate by income and race in this country far too much in terms of housing. Now, a lot of it's not done through deliberate policies anymore. We've done away with the explicit redlining and so on. But a lot of it still exists indirectly through things like zoning laws. You're going to hear a little bit more later on about the project I'm working on in California, on poverty and inequality in California. Just to give you one example, 75 to 80% of all residential land in California is zoned only for single-family housing. That means you can't build a duplex or an apartment complex in those areas. That drives up the cost of housing beyond the reach of poor people in those areas, and then sort of ghettoizes them, forces the poor into communities where all the social pathologies of poverty are magnified over and over again. We need to deal with a lot of issues that simply prevent low-cost, low-income housing from being built. Zoning is probably one of the worst laws that's out there. It's not just zoning for things like single-family only, but it's also things that are minimum lot sizes, minimum floor space. They have to meet certain aesthetic standards, and so on. There are regulations in California. The California Environmental Quality Act is one of the worst. But in other states, there's all sorts of regulations limiting what can be built, where it can be built, how high it can be built. You have to have so many parking spaces for each apartment you build, 1.5 or 2 parking spaces every time you build an apartment. That drives up costs. All these sort of things make it very difficult to build inexpensive housing, which makes it very difficult for low-income people to move to where jobs might be, or to a better school, or to a lower crime area that they might want to do. We really need to be addressing that. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, housing is one of the highest, it's one of the ways that people build wealth in this country. And if you don't let poor people in on buying housing, you're going to keep passing on intergenerational poverty instead of building intergenerational wealth. Speaking of wealth, that's probably the fourth area I think you need reform on. Bizarrely, our social welfare policies encourage consumption and discourage wealth building. But you don't get out of poverty by consuming things. You get out of poverty by building wealth. You want to have savings. You want to have investments. You want to create businesses. Those are the type of things that are going to get people out of poverty. Yet we're so perversely moving in the other direction. If you get let's say if you get a welfare check and you go down and blow it all on the latest athletic shoes, We're perfectly fine with that. We don't care what you spend it on as long as you spend it all. But if you took that same check and you took some of that money and you put it in a 527 account so that your kids could go to school someday, we'll take away your welfare check. You'll violate the assets limits. If you have a car in many states, and in fact in the vast majority of states, if you have a car so that you can go look for a job, we'll take away your welfare check because you have an asset. These things make very little sense. On the other side of the equation, we make it perversely hard to bank if you're poor. Because we're so terrified between the war on terror and the war on drugs and all these sort of things, we've passed all these anti-money laundering laws that require you to provide all sorts of identification to simply open a checking account or a savings account. You hear a lot of argument out there, a lot of discussion out there about having voter IDs. And people argue that it's unfair or that it's necessary to protect bank integrity, and I don't want to get into all that. But I don't know how many people realize that in order to open a savings account, you have to have the same type of IDs. And there's been surveys that have shown that about 20% of low-income people lack the proper ID to be able to open a savings account. And just imagine what it means if you don't have a bank account. First of all, obviously you can't build up money and borrow against it for credit, get a credit card or things like that regular people do. But it also means if you get paid, you've got to go down to one of these check cashing places and pay an exorbitant fee in order to cash your check. And then you have to walk around with a wad of money in your pocket because you can't deposit it anywhere, which means either you're going to get robbed or the police are going to think you're a drug courier and take it through asset forfeiture and things like that happen. We just make it very difficult. Our bias is against savings, and it should be exactly the other way. And lastly, I think we need to look at things that I talk about and call inclusive growth. As I mentioned, I think at the beginning, modern free market capitalism has done more than anything in history to lift people out of poverty. It builds wealth. If you were to take, draw a line through a society of the net worth of people, the average income of people, wealth in society, what you'd find is that throughout almost all of human history, mankind was miserably, desperately poor. And they were ruled over by a small group of people who were slightly less miserably, desperately poor. And then about 200 or 300 years ago, something changed. And people talk about it as the hockey stick. And you see the lines moving like this, flat. And then all of a sudden, wealth in the world shoots up on a per capita basis and total. And what was that change? That was the advent of modern free market capitalism. So I think that we know that entrepreneurship and free markets build wealth. Yet I also have to kind of throw in a caveat here, because if we're talking about reducing poverty, it only helps if we can get everybody to participate in that free market capitalism. If everybody has a chance to get there. I mean, we know what can do sort of build wealth overall. We know how to build free markets overall. We know we need a tolerable level of taxation. We can't overtax people. We know we can't overregulate. We know that, we want to cut taxes and regulations in order to get generalized economic growth. But at the same time, we have to make sure that that everybody, the people at the bottom, the people who are low income, that they are fully participating in that economic growth, that we don't essentially create a two-tier system in which all the gains of economic growth go to people at the top of the income scale, and and none of it goes to people at the bottom. And here, once again, we can look at government policies that sort of crowd people out and prevent them from becoming part of the growing economy. I'm thinking about things like occupational licensing laws in this country. The fact is that we have about 25 to 30% of all the jobs in this country require you to get permission from the government in order to be able to practice your profession. And I'm not talking about just things like, being a surgeon or something like that, where you say, okay, I can understand why they want those licenses. I'm talking about hairdressers, beauticians, funeral attendants, tree trimmers, hair braiders. You can go on and on with these, very minor jobs, certainly jobs that are not dealing with health and safety. And yet you still have to go and get a license from the government in order to practice these professions. Often these restrictions make very little sense. The fact is, it takes longer to get a job to be a beautician. It takes both more money, it costs more in terms of the courses and the tests you have to take, but also you have to spend almost 2 years being a beautician compared to about 3 months on average to be an EMT. And if you ask me which is more likely to kill you, the local hairdresser or an EMT who doesn't get it right, it doesn't quite make sense that you're really putting the pressure on the beautician. But you want to know how this works in terms of poverty. Let me just give you one example out of Louisiana. Let's say you have a young single mother in Louisiana. She's on welfare, but she wants to get off. She wants to get a job. And so she takes stock of her skills. And one of the things that people have told her is that she's got a pretty good eye for designing things. She often, she grows some flowers in her garden. And she, makes bouquets out of them, and people come in and said, "Oh, these are really nice. You really have a nice eye for this sort of thing." So she says, "I want to be a florist." Well, it turns out in Louisiana, to be a florist, you have to take a 6-month course in floral arranging, because after all, get those roses in the wrong place, they'll kill us. So she takes the 6-month course. She has to buy the textbooks for it. She has to go twice a week to this course, which means she has to find childcare for her kid while she's taking this course, this 6-month course. Having completed the course and paid the fees for the course and bought the textbook for it, she then has to take a test to test her floral arranging skills. That test is only given twice a year, and it's only given in Monroe, Louisiana. So she has to find childcare for the kids, drive to Monroe, Louisiana, get a hotel room because it's a 2-day test, and then she can pay for the test, take the written test, and if she passes all these sort of things, then she becomes a florist. And then, of course, she can go home and she can start selling flower arrangements out of her house, right? Well, no, that doesn't work either, because you have not only do you have residential zoning, you have occupational zoning laws, which says you can't do a home business out of your house unless it meets certain requirements, none of which she is likely to be able to meet out of her small apartment or her small home out of these things. She has to buy a storefront if she wants to be the florist or go to work for somebody else. None of these things make sense if you want to get people out of poverty. Another area we can look at is childcare. We know if you're a single parent and you're trying to get a job, childcare is an enormous problem. Roughly 60% of Americans live in an area that's called a childcare desert. That's an area where they simply cannot find affordable childcare within a drivable distance of their house. And once again, government regulations are largely responsible for this. One of the reasons why childcare costs so much is that there's a host of regulations that childcare have to meet, and we're not talking about simple health and welfare regulations. Yes, you don't want, you want to make sure that the pedophile isn't the childcare operators. You want to do background checks. You want to make sure that they're not just, there's not poison under the sink, that sort of thing. But do you really need to have everyone? Again, I go to California as an example, where every child care provider has to have an education degree. You have to have bilingual only child care providers. How about 75 feet of minimum space outdoors and 150 feet of minimum space indoors per child? Not counting things like closet space or cabinets or anything like that. Because I'm sure 74 feet of outdoor space would be totally unacceptable. Do you have to have minimum staff ratios? Simply adding in one child or one adult per child to the minimum staffing adds $2,000 per year to the cost of childcare. So simply looking at these regulations, removing some of these regulations would open up childcare, particularly of the type that parents tend to prefer, which is sort of localized childcare, not the big institutional daycare models, which benefit from these barriers to entry. Removing those sort of barriers would open up childcare, make it easier for parents to go get jobs and to still have their kids cared for. Minimum wage laws. We're now pushing for $15 an hour minimum wage. Look, the simple fact is that you can't force, the actual minimum wage. You can set any minimum wage you want in law. The actual minimum wage is always zero because businesses can always choose not to hire you. And if you force someone to be paid, a business to pay someone more than the value added they bring in terms of their work, particularly as an entry-level position, you're going to make it very difficult for businesses to hire them. We always, minimum wage, I should note that the literature around minimum wage is murkier than it used to be. We used to always say, you increase the minimum wage, you could wipe out jobs. And to some degree, that's still true. That's still kind of a consensus out there. But some people do benefit. You basically raise wages for some people and other people lose out. And it's always a tricky balance between whether more people gain or more people lose on this. For example, the Congressional Budget Office has, I think, come out with a report recently and said if we raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour, you'd raise wages for some 6 or 7 million people, but about 1.5 million people would lose their jobs. So it's basically the minimum wage increases wages for the low skilled at the expense of killing jobs for the even less skilled. So the question is how you want to play these things and whether or not you think that's the best way to subsidize low income wages. Essentially, I want to leave some time. I understand there's going to be some question and answer time, and I want to leave a lot of time for that. So I don't want to just kind of beat a dead horse into the ground with all these things. But I think the larger point is that if we want to get people out of poverty, we should get out of their way. Poor people are not, by and large, lazy. There's no evidence. If you look at survey after survey, low-income people have the same aspirations of middle-class and upper-income people. They want to achieve. They want to support their families. They want to get ahead. That the fact that they are not able to is often the direct result of the government policies we have today. In fact, if you ask low-income people about these policies, they agree with us. Cato's done a big survey on this, and we asked people, do you think it's more important that we have a growing economy with more entrepreneurship, more job creation, or do you think it's more important that we raise social welfare benefits? And by about 4 to 1, people who were on welfare themselves said, no, it's much more important that we have a growing economy and more entrepreneurship and more wealth creation than that we have more social welfare benefits. The people who depend on these benefits themselves know that the answer is to give them an opportunity to create wealth for themselves, to get jobs for themselves, to become self-supporting, to become masters of their own fate. And in order to do that, we're going to have to get government out of the way. And with that, I'm going to turn it back and let you folks ask me some questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. That was a lot of information. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. You can put your questions in the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will read those questions to Michael, and he'll respond to them. While you're thinking about your questions, I have a couple of questions of my own that I'd like to ask, if you don't mind, Michael.
Go right ahead.
First of all, great presentation. I appreciate that. Since you wrote your book, obviously before the pandemic, you could not have anticipated the potential effects of the policies with respect to the COVID pandemic. But I wondered, if you were to write a revised edition, what have we learned about those policies and their impact on poverty and inequality?
Yeah, COVID, both the pandemic itself and the government response, which is the basic all the shutdowns and all the capacity limitations, all that went with it, both fell by far hardest on the poor. For a lot of reasons. One is that they were the least likely to be able to transfer their jobs to sort of home work. mean, basically, Cato closed his doors. I picked up my computer, went back to my house, and kept up doing my job exactly the way it was. And if you were a waiter or a waitress, or working in a warehouse someplace, or a food service, or in a grocery store, those sort of options don't accrue to you. So you were much more at risk for coming down with the disease, or you were in a type of job that when they closed their doors, you couldn't go home and work. So you got hit with it at both ends of the equation there. You also had, once childcare went out of business, the schools closed, you then were suddenly faced with a childcare shortage, particularly single parents and women who had to drop out of the labor force to deal with those issues. So everything sort of just compounded on low-income people. And what we found out was that many of these regulations that I'm talking about made it much harder for them to do these sorts of things. For example, occupational zoning laws prevented, if you were in a catering business, you couldn't do catering from your home, and that was the type of business that you couldn't. I can write from home. Doesn't violate occupational zoning. But somebody who was going to be cooking desserts and shipping them out of their house, that would have. So they were blocked on those sort of things. Labor mobility. We recognized how important labor mobility was. About half of all jobs that were closed aren't coming back. Restaurants that went out of business are gone for good. Little mom and pop stores that went out of business are gone for good. People are going to have to go into new jobs and new professions. And here we run into occupational licensing provisions, for example, that prevents them from starting a job or doing some things like that. So they got hit with it. Minimum wage laws make very little sense right now in particular. I mean, we can argue about whether or not the minimum wage should go up or down in the long term. But if you're telling a restaurant that can only operate at 50% capacity and then telling them they have to double their wages that they're paying their workers at the same time, that doesn't make a great deal of sense. That restaurant's not going to be around for very long. So we need to look at that. Again, childcare regulations, all these sort of things, all these regulations that I talked about being bad, they became much worse during the pandemic.
My other question has to do with your California initiative, and I believe it's called the I can't remember the name of it.
The Project on Poverty and Inequality in California.
Ah, yes, thank you. Could you explain a little bit about that and the kinds of initiatives that you've undertaken in that state?
Yeah, we thought California was a terrific model to look at poverty and inequality for two reasons. One is, of course, the fact that trends that start in California end up going everywhere. I mean, it's about every other week Paul Krugman writes a column explaining how California is the model for the nation. Guess that one about as right as the other stuff that Paul Krugman writes about. But it does send things to spread there. After all, it's a tenth of the country in terms of the population and the economy and so on. So it's big. The second part of that is California is a sort of a classic case of all that I'm talking about. You have a state that's had reasonably solid economic growth, about 4.5% on average for the last 10 years before the pandemic. It's a state that has pockets of enormous wealth. I mean, you've got Silicon Valley, you've got Hollywood, you've got Beverly Hills, pockets with great wealth, billionaires and billionaires there. You have a strong social safety net. They have one of the strong, the most extensive systems of redistribution and social welfare in the country. They also have the highest poverty rate in the nation. California has a higher poverty rate than Mississippi or Louisiana or Alabama. Places you tend to associate with poverty, Arkansas. California, there's clearly something going on that's not working there. So we thought that was a particularly good area to go in and study. We took this on about 2.5 years ago. Before the pandemic, I was spending about every other week out in California to actually be on the ground. We want to make sure that we're sort of not parachuting into to a state and saying, hey, we're from Washington, we've got all the answers, we've solved everything for you, just listen to us. So I spent a lot of time on the ground, now by Zoom, talking to the people on the front lines. We've talked to politicians in all parties. We've talked to social activists. We've talked to people who deal in charities. We've talked to the poor themselves. I went out and wandered through homeless encampments out there and talked to the people who were living on the street. We tried, and essentially, we found that there's a willingness to listen to new ideas out there. That maybe it's just because things have gotten so bad they're even willing to listen to me. But there is a willingness to talk about new ideas and build coalitions that didn't exist before. You have to kind of talk their language. You can't come in and lecture. You have to understand, intersectionality and social justice and things like that, on how they think about them out there. But if you can talk to them about those things, you can get them to listen to free market ideas, and you can build coalitions. I've met with the United Farm Workers. I've met with the NAACP. I've met with the various chambers of commerce, the Hispanic and Asian and Black chambers of commerce out there. So you can talk to folks out there about these type of reforms, and you get the same sort of thing. We need to reform their education system. They have limited. They have no school choice to speak of. They have no private school choice. They have a very limited charter system there where it's very regulated, and they're capping it. So we need more educational choice. They have, as mentioned earlier, the housing restrictions are horrible out there. They're 3.5 million housing units short from their current needs for what it takes in terms of housing. The population, one of the reasons why it's not growing anymore. People talk about people moving out of California. The outflow rate from California is about what it's always been. What's happening is people aren't moving into California, and they're moving in. The average cost of a house is now $1 million in California. The average cost of an apartment in a city like LA or San Francisco is $2,500 for a 2-bedroom apartment, $2,500 a month. So it's a basic supply and demand. There's a lot of demand for housing and very little supply out there because the regulations are preventing it. So we've been able to talk to them about that. We've been able to talk to them about occupational licensing, occupational zoning, the need to reform child care regulations, and they're willing to listen regardless of party out there right now. So hopefully we'll be able to make some reform.
Even about your assessment of the minimum wage?
That one hasn't gone over as well as some of the others, but actually you do hear discussion of that in areas like the Central Valley. The minimum wage, fortunately, it's not statewide. So in San Francisco, having a $15 minimum wage is not really a big deal. It's like saying, in New York City. I mean, they're paying that now to almost everybody for everything. You work at a McDonald's in San Francisco, you get $15 an hour, even without the minimum wage. But if you go to Fresno, $15, about half the people make less than $15 an hour. So if they had a statewide minimum wage increase there, it'd be huge. And so, the mayor of Fresno said, tell them in Sacramento not to have a statewide minimum wage.
Okay, let's get to some of the questions that people have posted here online. I want to start with Brian's question, and he has a question about the current administration and whether or not the current administration's policies and spending is promoting economic growth or dependency.
No. It's actually, I find the question of the current administration's policies. The current administration doesn't actually have policies. They've got a checkbook. And their answer to everything is, we'll just spend more money on it. And kind of without paying any attention to whether a program works or not, without any evidence of whether or not there's going to be adverse consequences or second and third degree outcomes on these things. I mean, things that there's no discussion, there's no debate. Instead, we simply say we were spending $1 trillion, let's spend $2 trillion. And see what happens. That's not going to do anything to change things in the long run. Now, I will say some of the original stimulus made a certain amount of sense. I mean, if the government was deliberately shutting down businesses, the government kind of owed those businesses something to keep them going. So some of the things that were in the original Paycheck Protection Act or whatever it was called, I forget at the time, that was designed to enable them to keep their employees on the payroll, stuff like that. It was poorly designed. It ended up going to big businesses and not the businesses it was intended to. Less than 2% went to African American owned businesses, for example. These sorts of things were problematic, but the basic idea of it made a certain amount of sense. What you're doing now to simply, to send another $2,000 or whatever it is to everybody in America, we're going to do it again and keep doing it again and again and again. It's inflationary. It doesn't do anything to stimulate business. We're already found a lot of evidence to suggest that people just use it to pay down their bills, not to go out and buy new stuff. So there's not even a Keynesian type of stimulus involved in this. And does very little good. And often they're just kind of chasing their tail with these things. For example, on child care. Rather than doing anything to bring down the cost of child care, Biden simply wants to increase the child care subsidies. So what you get is there's about 4 or 5 giant daycare providers in this country that are in all 50 states, and they provide this giant institutional daycare. They're going to make out like bandits on this sort of thing. They're just going to raise their prices, and they're going to get a bigger subsidy out of it. But it's not going to do anything for the average family out there which doesn't live near one of these providers or really wants to send it down the street to the little mom and pop's place that has 10 kids, and they know the people who are charged down there, and they want that sort of thing. So it's not going to do anything like that. On housing, he wants to increase subsidies to build low-income housing, but doesn't want to do anything about the zoning laws that drive up the cost of that housing to begin with. So it's always just sort of chasing your tail, not dealing with the underlying causes of it at all.
Callista has a question about comparing the economic impact of, I guess the two approaches you've described are, one is reducing barriers, get government to stop doing the things that it's doing. Another approach would be the more active approach, government to spend more money on programs. Callista asked the question, what would be the different economic impact of those two approaches, reducing barriers to entry for new businesses, for example, childcare, compared to more government funding for low-income families?
Yeah, the policy, the sort of current policy, the Biden policy is kind of classic. Break your leg, and then the government will give you a crutch, and everybody will cheer, how generous you were for coming up with that crutch program. And I'm sure it'll be a gold-plated crutch. They'll have all sorts of regulations about how, crutch manufacturing, and it'll be only domestic content and so on. In the short term, it probably doesn't make that much difference. In fact, in the shortest term, it probably giving people the subsidies probably does help, because it takes time to build for new interests to come into the field and lower costs and so on. Whereas you can give, the government, if it's efficient at anything, it's efficient at writing checks, so it can sort of get that money out the door right away and things like that. In the medium term, I would say that there's probably not a whole lot of difference. In the long term, however, you can't keep chasing your tail forever. And unless you actually deal with the underlying problem and bring down costs, you're not going to solve the long-term problem. The other part of this is sort of distributional. The people who are going to benefit most from the subsidies are going to be kind of upper middle class folks. And there's a real elitism that goes on here in terms of, what's your child care look like? It's designed by sort of upper middle class lawyers for what type of child care they want. And it's not always in the surveys of child care that their lower income parents would choose. Often they just want child care, period. They don't necessarily care if it has the latest toys or the education credits that the instructor has or things of that nature. They simply want child care close to their home, that's safe and reasonably priced. So we often sort of design it with this elite attitude of what it should look like for their kids out there, and they are the ones that are most likely to get the subsidies and benefit from the subsidies when they come. The low-income people simply don't have a place to apply them in many cases in their neighborhood.
I know in your discussion of education policy, you focused on early childhood education, but one of the concerns that many people have, and I'm sure many people listening to you today, is the cost of higher education and access to higher education. I wonder if that plays a role in, creating opportunity for human flourishing and escaping poverty, and what reforms do you see in that area? And perhaps you could talk a little bit about some of the reforms proposed by the left in that.
Yeah, the free college reform, or we're going to kill $50,000 worth of student debt. Talk about redistributive. policies that go in the wrong direction. So if you graduate from Harvard and go on to law school, we're going to cancel $50,000 of your student debt, and we're going to pay for that by raising taxes on an auto mechanic somewhere. That seems to me sort of to be the opposite of progressive in terms of these things. Second, we know that there's tons of literature through the years, and it's kind of a general agreement, even among liberal or left-wing economists, on this, that raising subsidies to education has simply been passed through in terms of higher tuitions. That every time you generate more scholarships and more education funding, the colleges simply raise their tuition to absorb it. And an awful lot of it ends up being spent not on student activities or student instruction or things like that. It goes to research, goes to stuff that's designed to build academic prestige and so on, and this sort of thing. And then finally, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that some of the most expensive colleges don't provide a lot of bang for their buck in terms of generating income after you get out. You're actually sort of in a mid-range college that's affordable. End up in terms of your income post-graduation better off at a Northwood than say at a Harvard, where one, you got a better education, but number two is that you're paying a lot for the name recognition of the Harvard, rather than necessarily that you're going to get a much better course of instruction places like that. So those things make a big difference.
Bryce has asked a great question here, I think, about the pandemic and the way it may have changed people's thinking about the role of government. And I know, for example, that people were looking at our regulatory system and seeing how that might have slowed things down at a time when we needed more flexibility. Perhaps there are other lessons that we've learned from the pandemic that apply to our anti-poverty programs. And he wonders, as far as families being able to get their necessities in a time of emergency, has this COVID shed more light on these issues related to poverty and inequality?
Yeah, I think first of all, and probably the last part of the question that Bryce asked, I think, yeah, it has shined a light on it. I mean, seeing the food bank, seeing people lined up in their cars to get a meal and stuff like that. A lot of poverty in this country has been hidden, and this sort of brought it out into the light in ways that we saw. Now, a lot of that will shrink. I mean, as people get back to work and things like that, there's a lot of first timers and people who need it, but we'll have a lot of people who live close to the edge, and I think it exposed the fact that it's very easy to fall down below the poverty level. The sort of working poor. I think it generated a lot of attention for that. In terms of policies, I think it did both good and bad. I think we did learn that we overregulated. The FDA is not going to have anywhere near the respect that it had once before. People said, if the FDA limited a drug coming onto the market, people just sort of accepted that and said they're the experts. I think there's a lot more questioning of that sort of thing now. Telemedicine has exploded, and interstate licensing of doctors and physicians, allowing people to practice across state lines. Those sorts of things have extended dramatically during the pandemic, and they're not going to go back either. Even occupational licensing has expanded, I mentioned earlier, because of labor mobility things like that people are looking at in different ways. On the other hand, you see the Biden approach, amongst other things, look, we've got a crisis. We have to do something. Let's do it right away. And you're seeing, both in terms of spending money, but also in terms of government power. You're seeing in terms of the shutdowns. Now, for example, I'm a believer that the shutdowns did less in terms of both dealing with the pandemic and causing economic hardship than is commonly believed. I think they actually sort of mirrored general reactivity in society that was going on, regardless of the legalities involved. There's a fair number of studies out there that shows that, look, people weren't going to go to movie theaters regardless once people started dying in large numbers. So you can mandate the movie theater close. It's simply the movie theater is going to close no matter what. And so a lot of that was going to go on anyway. But we did have a lot of overreach in terms of, executives in Michigan, a classic example, legislatures in session, the governor simply kind of ignoring them and throwing out policies, this, that, and the next thing without necessarily any legislative backup on that. Even if those things were justified, they should have been done through the normal legislative process. And so I have some questions about that. You see the CDC implementing a rent eviction moratorium. Four courts have now thrown that out. The CDC there's nowhere in their charter that gives them the right to regulate rents in this country. I mean, things of that nature. So it's not a case of where because something needs to be done, we should sort of throw out the regular order on things. And I think we have to worry a little bit about the fact that we've sort of gotten this idea that in emergencies, government just has to act. Process really does still matter. And that was, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration are guilty of that.
A lot of my students ask me about guaranteed basic income as an anti-poverty policy. I know that does sometimes receive some bipartisan support. I'm wondering what your position is on that. Also, perhaps job guarantees as an anti-poverty program.
Yeah, I differentiate between the two of them. I'm actually, somewhat sympathetic to the arguments on a universal basic income. It actually has an interesting free market pedigree. I mean, you can go back, Milton Friedman with the negative income tax. Even Hayek and Nozick talked favorably about it as possibilities. They didn't support it per se, but they were kind of open-minded about the idea. Charles Murray, of course, talks about it, is strongly in favor of it. And it does have a fair amount to recommend it in the sense that it is more transparent. It treats people like. It's not a question of how well do you manage the system in terms of how much benefits you get. If can you finagle your way through all the paperwork, you can get more benefits than somebody who can't, that sort of thing. It treats poor people like adults. You give them money and expect them to budget and figure out what they're going to do with it, which makes much more sense than the current system, which says, you can have X amount for housing, Y amount for food, but if you want to spend less on housing and more on food, we don't allow you to do that, that sort of thing. We treat them kind of like they're a 5-year-old getting an allowance. Then we start putting also restrictions on it. You can't buy fish with your food stamps. You can't take TANF money out of a bank machine more than once a day. All these sorts of things that go on. It deals with the disincentive for work problem. And a lot of people say, well, you give people a universal basic income, nobody will work. Well, if you keep it low enough, that's not liable to be the case. But the current welfare system has a huge disincentive for work. Now, we talk a lot as economists about marginal tax rates. The highest marginal tax rate in the world is not on a millionaire or a billionaire, but on somebody who leaves welfare for their first job. If they pay taxes, the payroll tax on the first dollar they earn. Very quickly, you start losing benefits. You start losing, the dollars, 50 cents in benefits for every dollar you earn, type of thing. And you incur the expenses of going to work, child care, transportation, clothing, all of that. You can actually end up lower total income if you take a job than if you stay on welfare. So there's a huge disincentive to work. I said earlier, poor people aren't lazy, but poor people also aren't stupid. If you pay them less to work than they'll get from staying home, they're going to stay home. The UBI, you get that flat amount, and anything you earn above it, you get to keep. So it tends to make sense. The problem is it's just unaffordable. If you're going to give everybody in America, Andrew Yang talks about $2,000 for every person in America. That's $24,000 a year per person, 300 some odd million Americans. You're already bigger than our entire federal budget. Even if you were to wipe out all social welfare programs that currently exist, which is what Charles Murray would do, for example, you're still about $800 billion short in terms of balancing it. So I've just never been able to see anything that made the numbers add up. If you could do it, I'd rather see it done than the current system. I think it makes more sense than the current social welfare system. I've just never been able to figure out a way to make it work. On the job guarantees are just a terrible idea. They're simply having the government compete with the private sector in terms of creating jobs, and that's a recipe for a lot of high cost, low impact jobs that don't actually create any wealth.
If we could just use a few moments to answer one final question. You talked about displacement, and Michelle has a question about technological change. And let's see, whether or not that has negatively impacted employability, especially among groups in the lower income strata.
Yeah, huge. It does. We are automating. People worry about jobs going overseas. That's a small fraction of job displacement. Most job displacement is automation. Robots are the threat to the jobs of the future. Look, if they ever perfect the self-driving car, just imagine what that does. The taxi drivers, Uber drivers all go away. The trucker that that brings around the stuff to the local grocery store, they disappear. Long haul truckers disappear. We're talking about roughly 4 million jobs that would vanish almost overnight if we perfect the self-driving car. And those are largely the type of jobs that people without a college education and so on can do. You don't have to be a computer programmer type of thing to do them. And for all that, we're going to retrain everybody to be a computer programmer stuff. That's not that easy as people tend to think. So you've got to pay attention to the fact that that's going to hit. Ultimately, the answer is we need a better education system so that the people at the low end of the skill scale have better skills and are better able to handle the changes that are coming. We're never going back to the 1950s. One of the things that annoys me the most about politicians, and Donald Trump did it all the time. Joe Biden is the master of it, except he does it with a more empathetic voice. But it's this idea that somehow we're going to return to the 1950s, and all those jobs that are gone from the factory are going to come back somehow. We're going to recreate, what our parents lived in, and it's not true. Those jobs are gone for good. They're not coming back. And we have to adjust to the fact that it's a new world. We're going to have a more service-oriented, more intellectual and material-oriented economy. And it's what we should want. Do people really aspire to the idea that their kids should work sewing machines in South Carolina, sewing T-shirts for the rest of their life? I don't think that's what we aspire to.
Well, Michael, we've come to the end of our scheduled time. There are some questions we didn't get to, but I want you who are attending this online to know that Michael has graciously agreed to check in with our online discussion community later. So if you have additional questions for him and you post them there, there's a good chance that you'll get a response to those. And I want to thank you again for an enlightening presentation. And thank you all for joining us.